Hello again. I'm delighted to welcome you back to the plenary session, Building Back Better. Can the crisis become an opportunity to reduce homelessness? The pandemic and the resulting economic insecurity by increasing mass unemployment. And it's also resulted in governments throwing away the rule book and overturning old policy gospels. So this session will ask the question, how could this new era of policy fluidity create new policy fundamentals that mean less homelessness, not more? To answer these questions, we have an outstanding lineup of speakers, including a couple of international experts dialing in from different parts of the world for this session. And I really thank them for joining us live despite the extraordinary time differences. So our panelists for this session are Jennifer Friedenbach, the Executive Director of the Coalition on Homelessness from San Francisco in the United States. Juha Kaakinen, the CEO of Y Foundation in Finland, and Angela Jackson, the lead economist from Economists, who'll start with a short opening presentation. We'll start with a short opening presentation from each speaker. Following that, the three panelists will join me for a discussion and answer all of your questions. So remember, you can submit them at any time, and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can later on in the session. So now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Angela Jackson.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for having me. Look, I'd like just to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I'm calling from today. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, we often say at this time of year that it's been a year like no other and the unexpected has happened, but I don't think there's ever been a year like 2020 where it's been truer. At the start of this year, in some ways it's ending like it started, where we were really mainly concerned about a trade war with China as being the major economic risk on the horizon, and we seem to be back there again. But in the meantime, a lot has changed. When I was first asked about the pandemic and its economic consequences on a TV show, The Virus, it's the first ever one that they ran all year after that sort of first one back in February, what it would mean if the pandemic continued, I had to stop because it really seemed unfathomable, the idea that it would spread outside of China and that it might continue to impact our economy. And I said one word, it'd be catastrophic. And catastrophic is what it was. We have never seen an economic shock like the pandemic, like COVID-19 in living memory. To see economies literally shut down overnight, hundreds of thousands of Australians joining the unemployment queue overnight. It is unprecedented, and it led to, I think, a rethinking about what was possible for us as an economy and as a society. And as we rebuild, I think the important thing is going to be to not lose sight of that. If we think back to March and what occurred in those short few weeks, it was, again, almost unthinkable. We saw the job seeker payment that people like ACOS and people across the social services sector, the BCA, in fact, it's got widespread support, have been pushing for a modest increase for a number of years, suddenly was doubled overnight. We saw childcare. Again, people had been pushing for greater access to affordable childcare in Australia for a generation. Suddenly it was free. We suddenly saw state governments move mountains to homeless people who'd been allowed to sleep rough on our streets. Suddenly accommodation was found. We saw the power of government that could swiftly move and come in and solve some of the social problems that we faced almost overnight. And it felt like a new dawn. It felt like anything was suddenly possible. While we were facing this huge threat, it seemed that for once, as a society, if we could accept that people weren't necessarily at fault themselves, we could suddenly solve a lot of these problems very, very quickly. But now we're moving into the recovery phase, and that consensus does seem to be dissipating somewhat. And I think while clearly, I think it's therefore important for us at this point to look back at what has occurred and the clear links that we have seen between poverty and health and the economy in particular, because I think then it becomes clearer what this path to recovery maybe looks a lot more like. We saw specifically how important housing was. Now, we know how important housing is, and I know people listening today understand how important housing is, but we saw that almost immediately the government understood that as the biggest expenditure for households, it was one of the biggest risks of the pandemic. So we saw rental relief happening overnight, we saw mortgage relief from the banks, we saw the government moving to secure people's housing. Housing is also obviously important because of the asset that it provides for households. And so again, we saw the government looking really to secure the housing market so that there wasn't necessarily this crash in housing and asset prices that might hinder the recovery. But we also saw this real link, and we often think about housing in terms of it being a social determinant of health. In Victoria, we saw that, overcrowding and the link then to the pandemic and the health implications of that were just really clear for everyone to see. We also saw the impact of housing on education. We saw that when we were schooling our kids at home, how difficult it was if you lived in overcrowded accommodation to work and to teach your kids. And this is the life that people are living every single day across Australia. So as we come out of this period, what do we learn and what do we see as our priorities? And I think it is clear that from an economic perspective, a greater investment in social and affordable housing will address some of those really systematic issues which are exposed by COVID-19, but also help us rebuild the economy now. And that's why the majority of economists, when they were polled recently, supported the stimulus spending on housing ahead of everything else, ahead of tax cuts, ahead of any other program. Social housing was their number one because it generates jobs today. It's got one of the highest multiplier effects in terms of housing investment. It's a widespread investment, so it supports our regions across Australia, and it employs more people in terms of the dollar spent than other forms of construction spending. But then there are long-term benefits that we can see in terms of lifting people's productivity, their ability, their health, and their ability to participate in the labour market, the educational outcomes of children, where we see social and affordable housing is a really worthwhile investment for this economic recovery. And then, of course, there's a critical impact and something that is certainly coming up in Victoria at the moment around the impact on homelessness. We know that social and affordable housing reduces the rates of homelessness, and it's a problem in Australia, despite having 26 years of economic growth and becoming one of the richest countries in the world. We still, over that period, didn't invest and didn't tackle the problem of endemic homelessness across Australia, and that investing more in social and affordable housing is a way to drive down rates of homelessness. That also delivers economic benefits in terms of again increasing labour productivity and taxation receipts, but decreasing government expenditure. So have government listened? Well, it's been patchy, I would say. We've seen certainly the federal government has turned its back on investing in social housing and the economic benefits that it could deliver. But we have seen last week, or yes, it was last week, at times going pretty quick at the moment in Victoria, an historic investment of $5.3 billion, which will deliver a once-in-a-generation investment in social housing. But it's not the end. It is literally just the beginning. And we need to see this type of investment year in, year out. And the risks I really see, I think, over the next 12 months is, the protective impact of the job seeker increase, the doubling, and now it's down to $250 a fortnight. It will go down to $150 a fortnight and then potentially be scaled out completely. Is the real risk for the economy is what happens in terms of that increasing poverty to homelessness and housing stress, which makes the investment from other state governments and from the federal government in social and affordable housing an even more higher economic priority. I think that's probably it for my time, and I look forward to hearing about what has been going on in other countries and then discussing with the panel some of the broader implications for the economy going forward.
Thank you, Angela. That was a really useful set of insights. We're going to turn now to the United States and Jennifer Friedenbach from San Francisco.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. And so I'm going to be speaking more from a local perspective and wanted to talk a little bit about the organization before I started, just to give some context. But what we do is we organize homeless people. and frontline service providers for permanent solutions to homelessness, and we protect the human rights of those forced to remain on the streets. So what I mean by organizing is that we are trying to build power and alter the relationship of power to homeless people to really affect change. And we use a diversity of tactics and do a lot of leadership development skills of unhoused San Franciscans so they can lead the fight. We gather input from hundreds more who are in crises, who can't get involved. And we use a variety of tactics like protest. We create direct access to people in power for unhoused people. We develop alliances with other organizations. We organize hearings at City Hall. We write legislation. We sue in litigation. We kind of comb through the city budget for fat and harmful budget expenditures and try to get that redistributed to housing for homeless folks. We go to the ballot. We use creative and mainstream media. So that's kind of about the organization. In the United States, of course, we have mass homelessness, and this has been the case since the early 1980s. We had a 77% cut to our federal housing budget. That hasn't changed since, and as you see in this graph, and the primary response has been the federal government washing its hands, and then the local municipalities criminalizing unhoused people as a response, instead of looking at the systemic causes and really trying to invest in housing to correct the situation. So in the early 1980s, we ended up in 1983 at that lowest point of funding. About 1 million men, women, and children found themselves without a place to call home. Of course, they weren't feeling like it would be cool, easy lifestyle to live outdoors, but it was a systemic issue. In San Francisco during COVID, we basically had a situation where the shelters closed. We had massive outbreaks in our shelters, especially one. The libraries and drop-in centers and other places where folks could use the bathroom or charge their phone or wash their hands, all cut off. The number of tents exploded as folks tried to shelter in place. We had a lot of mutual aid popping up in this, where people were giving out tents, et cetera. And the city moved, as Angela was talking about, really quickly to, they had some hand washing and some stuff going on, but they basically were able to move about 2,500 people into hotel rooms. We had about 2,200 people in shelters, so it was almost an even swap. But those who were left out really felt like the city was leaving them there to die. And we got that. We heard that from folks, and as we did outreach over and over again, and they were right. The number of deaths during COVID tripled, not from compared to the same period the year before, not from COVID necessarily, but deaths of despair like overdoses and isolation. So opportunities for change as we move forward. So, this pandemic, it's really created conditions for real systemic change. Suddenly the health of one is deeply linked to the health of all. We've seen that really motivate government to move quickly. In the United States, the federal response was not great, as to be expected with the administration, but we did have an emergency response through FEMA, which paid for about 75% of the hotel rooms. We had the state come in and give money to be able to purchase hotels. As we do community organizing, as we build power, to really have this change, it's critical that unhoused people are front and center in the building of the movement for social change and crafting the path forward. We need to make sure we do a ton of prevention and rental assistance. We don't want any preventable displacements. That means short and medium term and long-term rental assistance. We don't know where the economy is going. We don't know what's going to happen. People may need assistance to get back to work for a long period of time or short. But we need to make sure they have that assistance to stay in their homes. We have a ton of hotels that are empty, student dorms. Our tourism in San Francisco was obviously a big part of our situation here. And with all of those empty, it provide unique opportunities for purchase. And these owners don't like to be without money for long, and so it's really provided a big opportunity to buy hotels. They have bathrooms in the rooms already, and we could easily add efficiency kitchens for not that much more. We have vacant housing units. A lot of people are moving out of urban centers. Landlords are a lot more motivated to rent to impoverished households, of course, not lowering the rent as much as we'd like, and they would need rental assistance in order to do that. So this kind of begs the question, how do we pay for all of this? And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we did in San Francisco as one very ragtag, grassroots organization that has a big impact. We spent a year writing an initiative that we were bringing to the ballot. We basically taxed business income in San Francisco. This is over 50 million. So you don't get taxed this until your 50th million, get taxed a half a cent, and it brings in 300 million a year. Imagine that. So we did a ton of research to come up with this, and the money is, has to be spent, at least half on housing and at least a quarter on treatment, and no more than 15% on prevention, and shelter at 10%. And that was our kind of thing that we came up with based on our needs in San Francisco. And we built this really broad coalition. Unhoused people were a big part of it. Unhoused folks made about 90,000 calls to voters. We gathered signatures. We had about 700 volunteers on top of that were housed volunteers. It's really this basic, tax the rich, house the poor. We won, then we were sued, and then we won the lawsuit. And so a lot of, really magical moments throughout this whole process. But one of the magical moments is that just as we're moving out of COVID, we won the California Supreme Court case, and now this money's released, and we have about over $700 million for this recovery for San Francisco. So that's where we're at. But this is all of it, needs to be bird dogged all the way through to make sure it's done right, and they don't take the city to try to take the money to fill the recession, et cetera, or fill the shortfalls that the city's facing. But we're finding a lot of opportunity for change, a lot of connection that housed people are feeling to unhoused people that they didn't have previously, that we are working really hard to capitalize on. So I think I'm coming to an end here, and I know this kind of touched on a lot of things, and hoping we'll have some robust question and answers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. We now turn to Finland, where Juha Kaakinen, speaking from darkness at the moment, a different time of day. Juha.
Thank you, Michael, and a very early good morning from Finland. Glad to be back, even virtually. So about what has happened during the pandemic time in Finland. In spring, I think that the homeless population was the group of population that was least affected by COVID for some reason. The only major thing probably was that when we have people sleeping temporarily with friends and relatives, so they were more visible. But luckily we have very little of temporary accommodation, and for that reason there wasn't any dramatic things happening. But now we are in the middle of the second wave, and the cases are going up, and it seems also that the homeless population is more affected by COVID now. But basically there has been no change in the major policy on homelessness. We have been continuing in Finland the same policy we have had since 2008 to minimize the level of temporary accommodation based on permanent housing and on housing first policy. And at the moment, our present government has decided that the rest of the homelessness should be halved by 2023 and ended completely by 2027. And this definition of homelessness includes people living temporarily with friends and relatives, which is the main category in Finland of homelessness. I think that the pandemic has emphasized the role of different actors, especially the role of the state of the government. It has also underlined that it's possible to act without a delay. And now, of course, we are saying that we have the emergency situation, and for that reason, governments have done several things. But for homeless people, the emergency state continues even after the pandemic, unless something definitely different is going to be done. But I think that it has also highlighted the importance of the most important thing, which is social housing. And I think that at the moment we are all waiting eagerly for the vaccine to appear. And I would say that social housing is definitely the vaccine against homelessness. And actually, it has been scientifically proven to be 73% efficient. In 2018, a group of Australian researchers led by Guy Johnson made a big study, which one of their conclusions was that 73% of cases flowing into homelessness could have been avoided if people had been provided affordable social housing. So there are reasons why we should invest heavily on social housing. And the announcement by the Victorian state, of course, was quite encouraging. But I would like to give you some perspective on the scale of the investment in social housing. I understood that within the next 4 years, 12,000 units will be built, and it means that it's around 3,000 per 1 year. I looked at the statistics in Finland, and in this century, there has never been a year where there has been less than 3,000 new social housing flats built in Finland. The record year was 2009, when we had almost 14,000 new social housing flats. And in recent years, it has been, in most years, over 6,000 flats. And this year, it has been 9,000 flats. And this has been the crucial factor also in the trend of homelessness in Finland. And what's even more significant is that the role of the state can be enabling. It doesn't necessarily have to make itself the financial contribution. In Finland, it's based on a state-guaranteed loans, building affordable social housing, and it's done mainly by municipal housing companies and NGOs like Y Foundation. So it doesn't actually at the moment cost a penny for the state to have new social housing in Finland. Normally, according to the legislation, there would be interest rate subsidies, but because of the interest rate is so low, there's no need for that at the moment. And as some experts say, the interest rate will stay around the same level for the next 30 years. So now it's really the time to act and make a big difference for homeless people and people with low incomes. So I think that we have the vaccine against homelessness, and we have also, if needed, the intensive care called Housing First. And with these means, it's really possible to make a big change. Homelessness in Finland has been going down, and yes, there has been targeted measures, but the real game changer actually has been the social housing. I think you have always been asked to make 3 points, but this is the point I would like to make. So I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Juha. We have around 20-25 minutes now for questions and answers, for discussion. So I'd encourage everyone watching to submit your questions, and we'll relay through to the panel. I'm really struck by the very different patterns we've seen in each of the 3 countries that have spoken in this session. And I guess one of my observations in the Australian context is one of the real surprises, I suppose, or one of the positives, has been how well the different governments have worked together. So the states and territories have collaborated and cooperated quite actively through the much celebrated National Cabinet. And Jennifer, I wanted to ask you whether intergovernment coordination is something that you've seen in the US as well, or has that been less the case?
I would say pretty dysfunctional There is coordination at the federal level. There's a United States Interagency Council on Homelessness that tries to pull together the different entities and work together. I think, but there's not really, that doesn't end up leading to serious investment, which is what we need in systemic change. There's a lot of sort of rearranging the chairs, so to speak. On a local level, there's a pretty glaring lack of collaboration, especially with community. And so not just, you know, for many of the homeless programs in the United States, they're contracted out to nonprofit service providers. And there's very little coordination that happens. That's not to say that there are services that are duplicative. Pretty much all the services are completely overwhelmed. It's just there's not a lot of strategic thinking about where to deeply invest in order to get the biggest bang for our buck. And so I think that's, I mean, you know, we have problems with coordination between our Department of Public Health and our Homeless Services Department.
That's one of the concurrent sessions earlier this afternoon talked about that coordination between health departments or health agencies and homeless services, and that being a really crucial piece in the puzzle. Juha, is the homeless system in Finland and the health system, are they well integrated, or are they quite separate systems?
Well, I think that the main elements of our success has been the partnership between different organizations. Also, starting from the state authorities, local authorities, and NGOs, all these have worked in alliance towards the same goals. And of course, it's not always self-evident that different organizations work in good coordination, but there is a clear understanding that this is absolutely necessary, and it's the only way to reach sustainable results by working together.
Yeah.
So basically, for example, our support system is based mainly on the existing social and health services. We are not building so much new special services for homeless people because we rely on the existing social and health services, mainly managed by the municipalities and also NGOs working as service providers.
Yeah, I just
Jennifer,
wanted to
I think
add.
you wanted to add,
Yeah, just that in the municipalities in the United States where there is heavy coordination, that's where there's been the greatest amount of success. And that's where they have been really able to decrease their homeless numbers despite massive divestment on the issue from the federal government. And I also, I mean, I just want to, Juha's point about integration into broader poverty programs from a community organizing perspective, I think that's quite important as well. And so that, you know, it's almost gotten to the point in the US where homeless people are seen as an alien species that's somehow not connected to the rest of impoverished people, even though they're disproportionately Black, disproportionately members of the LGBTQ community, like people with disabilities. It's where all these different oppressions intersect in the United States and then kind of explodes in homelessness. But from a movement perspective, it's seen as some kind of separate issue that people somehow chose for themselves.
We're getting a good flow of questions coming through now, and I again encourage people to put in their questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. Juha, there's a question, I guess, of clarification about what is the spread of different built forms of stock types within the social housing builds you talked about. I mean, the numbers are quite inspiring, but what does it look like? Are they studio apartments, or what sort of built form are we talking?
There are all types of units, studio apartments, but also family homes, and of course it's based on the what's the need, local need. But I think that the most important thing about this Finnish social housing is that there's now an agreement between the state and the big cities that in each new housing area there's going to be at least 30% of affordable social housing. And it means that the rent level is significantly lower than the market rents. And actually the only public investment on this is that the cities give the construction sites the land lease with a 20% discount for the builders. So the lost income of this land lease is the only public investment at the moment. And the quality of this housing is good. It's the same quality as on the private market, because the state guarantee means that it has to be approved by the Housing Finance Fund of Finland, and they have a strict quality control. So this is important to understand the quality of the social housing.
Thanks, Juha. Andrew, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Look, it was great to hear that you're recognising structural poverty as a key underlying issue, and the question coming through in relation to that really is, given that, have you considered taking on more of an advocacy role, or the Economist more broadly, not just yourself, taking on more of an advocacy role on the issue, where there's a need to push for structural change? Speaking on behalf of economists.
Look, I think economists are, speaking on behalf of economists, which obviously I represent all, and we're all exactly the same. Look, I think economists have been out there pretty strong on this, to be honest with you, especially over the last 6 months, and pushing, social housing and social housing investment as, a key plank in the recovery. So, whether we could do more, I think, yes, that's certainly the case. And, I'm a health economist, so I think it's certainly explaining these linkages between poverty and productivity in particular is, a key role that I see for myself in my professional life in terms of drawing those linkages, because I think often we see this space not necessarily as an economic reform. The idea around addressing poverty is a way in which people's future productivity potential can really be unleashed, and that if you don't address disadvantage, particularly in kids, but across the life spectrum, and support people's mental health and all things that impact people's ability to participate in society and in the economy, then you're actually harming economic growth. And that's certainly, I think, the standpoint that I come from. You'll also, the OECD's actually just put out a really, the economic think tank that Matthias Cormann is trying to head up, whether or not they continue with this line or not under his leadership, we'll see. But they've just actually released a report that puts housing right at the centre of sustainable economic growth. So understanding its role, across the spectrum, homelessness being obviously one area where clearly the whole thing has just failed completely because someone doesn't have a home, but housing affordability more broadly has huge implications. Houses that are under financial stress don't make as good a decisions and can't invest in the things like their human capital to the same extent. They're therefore not as productive, and the whole economy suffers. Understanding these linkages, I think, is important, and it's an important role for me as an economist to explain those to policymakers. I think it's gaining traction. I think that is changing, but certainly in Australia, we're probably not as articulate in that space as potentially overseas, where health economists and people in this space are, I guess, more visible in the public debate and potentially listened to more by government.
Interesting point. Jennifer, there are a few questions coming in that I guess look to the future in the US. Given that the pandemic is widespread, well, it's a pandemic. There's significant numbers of cases in North America at the moment. How does that look for the homelessness system? Does the election change things? What are you anticipating for 2021?
Well, I mean, I think, unfortunately, homelessness is not made center stage on any of our major parties, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I think that, so it's kind of difficult to say. I think that we're obviously going to get, in terms of some of the massive cuts that were being pushed through by the Trump administration to housing, some of the uncertainties around the federal emergency management response, some of the, I mean, and you know, hopefully we have a little bit more of a resources in place to address the pandemic with the new administration. But I think that, and certainly a big part of it is our healthcare system and that not being dismantled. So it's almost like comparing treading water to sinking is kind of, you know, so in terms of massive change, I don't know. And that's where we've been, you know, I think in the, you know, in the United States, basically the municipalities who don't have the tax base to support it have been forced to address these major socioeconomic issues that are, you know, driven by racism and inequality and wealth disparities and all this stuff. And we're having to try to address it on the local level. And that's unfortunate because there's really not as much we can do locally, but I think we can still do a tremendous amount.
Thanks. I guess a question for both of our international panelists for a moment. Social housing in Australia is heavily stigmatised, remains quite stigmatised, with parts of the community and some policymakers really seeing it as a means of creating dependency or perpetuating poverty. Is this a stigma that exists in your countries? And if so, how are you tackling it, or how did you tackle it? Jennifer, perhaps I might come straight back to you before going to Juha.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we struggle with those issues in the United States. The United States is a highly politically conservative country. As much as people think of it as a diverse country, it's still, you know, 80% white. I mean, yeah. So I think our biggest problem that we see. I think that people kind of understand because so many people face the disparities on housing costs. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people in the United States are paying a disproportionate amount of their income on housing. And that makes it a little bit more relatable when people talk about any kind of rental assistance or something like that. Where the problem hits is when we try to put housing into different areas and people find out that it's for unhoused community, there's a huge amount of resistance to it and lawsuits and just huge amount of hatefulness that comes out that you know, in some situations, some of the project managers were uncomfortable moving forward because they literally thought people's, you know, personal safety would be at risk moving into the buildings. So I think how we address it is a really important question. And I'll just go back to organizing. I mean, we've got to have, you know, you got to knock on doors. You've got to have a plan. You've got to pull out people who are supportive. You have to create space in meetings that are taking place when these conversations are happening that people feel real uncomfortable being assholes. And we have to shift the cultural dynamic on this stuff. That means making sure that people who are unhoused are front and center, that their stories are being told, that space is created for them to speak for themselves so that the stigma can slide away because folks start realizing that they actually don't come from another planet. They've got blood pumping, you know, they have the same needs and wants. They're not as scary as folks thought they were. And so once those conversations happen, so that's a lot of our work is really trying to change that dynamic. And it takes work. It takes both community organizing and media messaging and a lot of leadership development among unhoused people.
Juha, would I be right in thinking that your context is slightly different in this respect?
Yes, certainly. It seems that there are countries where if you say social, it creates a stigma already. So actually, the social housing in Finland is not called social housing, it's affordable rental housing. And I think that there are two major elements which make the stigma disappear, and the other one is the quality of the housing, and the second one is, of course, the zoning, so that there's a social mix in housing areas. And these are very powerful means to make it acceptable for the general public. I think that these are probably the most important reasons. But of course, you have to remember that Finland is a very small country, very small economy, and it means that when we have economic recession, economy is going down, normally the construction companies become very much interested in building affordable social housing, which they normally don't want to do, because it's not a place to make profit from building social housing. And that explains also that there are some years when we have had even more social housing built than normal pre-market rental housing.
Thanks, Juha. Angela, I won't ask you to speak on behalf of all economists this time, but I guess we'd just be interested in your perspective on whether that stigma is as strong as it used to be, whether it's fading in this country. What are your thoughts?
Look, I think the issue around the stigma is if social housing is only for the absolutely most vulnerable and most disadvantaged, then it will be associated, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the less that you have, the less it is, people have experience of it firsthand, and therefore potentially the higher the stigma. I think it comes with, I guess, looking more at, broadening that out, therefore. So it is, yes, about social housing. And when we might think about that, we might think about all the supports that need to go around that, where housing is, the centerpiece, but there are supports around that. But really thinking about, a housing policy that ensures everybody has affordable housing, that we don't have people living in housing stress more broadly, that we see this as part of, I guess, the social safety net in Australia and the social contract in Australia, that housing needs to be part of that. I think what we've seen in this country is that, it is part of the wealth story, it's part of the prosperity story, but it's not sort of seen as that foundation, that everybody in this country has a right to secure affordable housing, and that should be seen as one of the foundation stones of our social safety net, rather than this sort of afterthought and the thing that comes in when everything else fails, which is where it is at the moment. And I think that's the problem. It's sort of homelessness is the failure of everything else, rather than seeing housing as the start of everything else. So I think that's about the conversations that I had. It's about really, and as I said, I think the OECD report's a really good place to start. I think discussing how housing needs to be not seen as the last thing, but the first thing in that social safety net. And I think that's the conversation that needs to change. And then the stigma changes, because it's not seen as, oh, you're the failure at the end that needs the help. It's seen as, this is something that we all get to share in at the start. Does that make sense? I don't know.
It does. And look, Angela, I'm going to stay with you for a little longer just for a follow-up question on one of your earlier comments around Australia perhaps being a little bit behind in the economic discussion around homelessness and social housing. And I wonder if you have thoughts on which countries are leading in that respect.
Look, this really more, I think, maybe this is a bit of a critique. It really, I think, goes to, the way in which economists more broadly, and I've been asked to speak for economists, engage in public debate in Australia in particular. I think we often, perhaps if you look at the UK, for example, where I have more experience than other countries necessarily, health economists in particular and economists more broadly provide a wider suite, I think, of views into the public discourse and public debate than perhaps occurs in Australia. And I think that is changing. I think, I'm involved in the Women's and Economic Network, and we're seeing more female economists. And I think, doing a good job at raising some of these issues around equity, around the socio-economic impacts of policies. But I think in the past, it has been, too narrow a focus of the profession. And I can go into the reasons for that. It's probably quite boring around some of the economic faculties across Australia being relatively conservative. But I think that is changing, and I think, voices are being expanded, but we are probably behind, I think, in our discourse and our engagement if you sort of look to the UK, where health economists in particular are much more engaged with government and policy making, and I think that's a positive thing. She says as a health economist, but I think it is a positive thing that economists who study these things and understand these issues participate more in public life and have a louder voice.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question to the panel as a group, and I'll let you decide who wants to take it on first. So, if we accept that a key driver of homelessness is structural inequality, how can we as a sector drive change that extends beyond crisis responses and withstands the dissipation of concern that we're now seeing? So I guess to give that a little bit of context, the response broadly across the nation during the height of the pandemic and the concern for public housing tenants, for the homeless, was very strong, and I think a shift in perspective. But we're starting to ease back to normal, or COVID normal. How do we keep that concern going, and how do we use that to drive a better response? Jennifer, do you have thoughts on that? This is I guess your
well, it's a really big question. I think and I think as much as we can do to build really strong alliances with so looking at it as a sector in terms of homelessness. And so we have, homeless service providers, maybe religious organizations, but really allying with labor and making sure that they're seeing the connection in these disparities, making sure that we're having strong alliances with, different neighborhood and political clubs, et cetera, and really building power towards a unified goal. And, when we look at disparities, and we're talking just kind of to circle back around to Angela's point, if we're thinking about housing as being the base and benefiting everybody, that is going to benefit the entire working class. And because it is a struggle, I think, homelessness and housing insecurity and people paying disproportionate amounts of their income on housing is a situation that affects all countries, and certainly in each of our countries we can build really strong alliances around that. If people have that basic of having a safe and decent place to live, that can go a long way towards erasing those inequalities. It can go a long way towards creating jobs and making sure that, many years ago we created a housing corporation, and we the first building that we purchased was we made sure that unhoused people did the rehab of the entire building, and they all got union cards coming out of it. So we formed an alliance with labor, made sure that people got jobs in the creation. We made sure in the running of the housing that people had economic development and community development along the way. People were able to stabilize and all the other positive things that go out. So that's one place where I feel like we can connect around inequality. But we need to form those strong alliances with groups that are speaking out against racism, that are working on a whole variety of issues. And I think that the mistake has been made in the United States and in a lot of countries where homelessness has really been a separate sidelined issue, rather than that housing is central part of equality.
Thanks, Jennifer. Juha, has public sentiment shifted at all in Finland? I mean, obviously coming from a very different base, but has there been a change in perspective at all?
No, I don't think that there has been any major change. Of course, it's when you want to end homelessness, it's a constant struggle. You can't stop for a moment, but I think that you can build a good circle of things by creating alliances, and I think that around social housing, that can be the foundation that you can build good circle that will finally lead to the ending homelessness. But it's not a sprint. It's a marathon, and for that reason, it means that you need to have a long-term commitment. And And of course, I know that there are many people who believe in legislation, that when we have a legal right to housing, that's the key issue. But it's also a very pragmatic question. It's good if you have a right to housing, but it's even better if you have a key to your own home.
Sorry.
So you have to be very pragmatic and
Juha, I'm
create
gonna have to cut you off there, I'm afraid. We only have a few seconds left, and I want to grab them very quickly to thank the three speakers, Jennifer, Juha, and Angela, for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fabian. Thank you.